Good morning, and thank you, Perrin, for that very, very generous introduction. And I want to just start off by saying that I echo your view and the view of your members that our economic recovery will very much need to draw on the leadership that you and businesses across the country are able to provide. And we will, I am sure, be calling on you. The council that you have formed is very good news for Canadians and for our government, and we look forward to working with you and drawing on your expertise, just as you were so useful and helpful in the early days of the pandemic, offering your guidance relating to PPE supply chains. I wanted to begin today's remarks by opening with a few words to frame the discussion. L'année écoulée a évidemment eu un impact énorme sur toutes nos vies, à la fois individuellement et collectivement, ainsi que sur les petites et grandes entreprises de tout pays. Tout au long de cette période, notre gouvernement s'est efforcé de veiller à ce que les soutiens appropriés soient en place pour protéger les travailleurs, les entreprises, les travailleurs de la santé de première ligne, les travailleurs essentiels et les Canadiens partout au pays. I think of the past year when I reflect on all that we have been through together as a country, as one involving the climbing of 3 mountains. And if you'll bear with me, I think you'll see what I mean. The first mountain was the PPE mountain. Okay, so we were confronted at the beginning of the pandemic with a desperate need for PPE. And at that time, I said to my Department of Public Services and Procurement Canada, we need to put in place long-term contracts for the delivery of PPE because we did not know at that time whether we would be hit with a first or second or third wave. And these contracts need to be able to deliver to Canadians over time. We work nonstop to get PPE and medical supplies for our frontline healthcare workers and essential workers. And the work was not easy. En raison de la demande mondiale, les premiers fournisseurs d'urgence ont été achetés en grande partie à l'étranger. Toutefois, les industries canadiennes ont intensifié leurs efforts et renforcé la capacité nationale, de sorte que la plupart de nos achats se font maintenant au Canada. In other words, what we were able to do is to embark upon massive procurements in PPE with over 2.7 billion individual pieces of PPE secured and 1.4 billion of those pieces of PPE delivered under the long-term contracts that we entered into. And in terms of domestic production, we now see over 45% of our PPE contracts by dollar value are with Canadian manufacturers. So what that tells us is that you, businesses right across this country, stepped up to produce PPE and assist in the effort to ensure that we are never again in a situation where Canada isn't producing its own PPE. The first mountain is one that we are obviously watching closely, this mountain of PPE supplies. And we are making sure that we will continually have that PPE on hand. In fact, we've had to procure additional storage space for the PPE, given how much we have procured. That is an important point because we are ready for any future waves of this pandemic. The second mountain relates to rapid tests. We saw that provinces and territories, frontline healthcare workers, border agents were calling for greater testing regimes, more rapid tests. What we did to climb that second mountain was to procure over 40 million rapid tests, with 19.6 million delivered to the provinces and territories already. We also know that some of those rapid tests at the provincial and territorial level aren't yet in use, and we strongly encourage provinces and territories to utilize those tests, because we know that the way out of this pandemic is to ensure that we have comprehensive testing and tracing regimes, as well as the next and third mountain that we are climbing relating to vaccine procurement. Our procurement approach has been deliberate, strategic, and comprehensive. We have produced and followed a diversified approach to vaccine procurement. We set out in this process last summer by signing 7 APAs, or advanced purchase agreements, with vaccine suppliers on the advice of the Vaccine Task Force and the Public Health Agency of Canada. So in other words, the contracts that we entered into weren't simply because the minister thought these were great companies. Rather, we followed the advice of the scientists, of the experts in industry, of the Public Health Agency of Canada before entering into these APAs. And then we followed suit on the basis of their recommendations and entered into 7 agreements in very short order over the course of the month of August and into the early fall, by ensuring that we had these 7 APAs in place. And that in itself was the first part of the climb up the third mountain, securing the APAs. We secured approximately 400 million doses of potential vaccine from 7 manufacturers. And when the results of the clinical trials for Moderna and Pfizer were announced in the early fall, we knew that we had to move quickly to get those vaccines into this country. And we negotiated early delivery of vaccines of Moderna and Pfizer that occurred coterminously with the regulatory approval. And so when we were confronted with the supply chain disruption from Pfizer, and to a lesser extent Moderna, in January, we said to ourselves that we were ahead of the game in December by securing those early doses into this country, but we were now confronted with the supply chain disruptions, which they mentioned to us would be temporary, which were temporary, and now we are seeing those supply chain disruptions behind us. We are back on track with 400,000 doses per week into this country just in the next few weeks alone, and then ramping up considerably in the spring with 23 million more doses on top of the 6 million that we will see into this country in Q1. So Q1 and Q2 is going to see the cumulative total of 29 million doses of Pfizer and Moderna, and then all told by the end of September, 84 million doses of vaccines. We are going to face a significant ramp up of vaccines in this country. Make no mistake. And therefore, parents' words at the very beginning that we need to work together, provinces, territories, the federal government, and businesses, to ensure a smooth vaccine deployment across this country over the next weeks and months is absolutely crucial. And I want to echo the need for us all to work together. I will say that our diversified procurement approach is now clearly paying off. We have 2 vaccines that have been approved. Indeed, the 2 vaccines that show the highest efficacy rate being at 95% and effective against many of the variants that we are seeing. We have 3 vaccine candidates in regulatory review, being Novavax, AstraZeneca, and J&J. And we have 2 still in clinical trials, Medicago out of Quebec and GSK Sanofi. So I want to tell you that this is a diversified procurement approach which will continue to serve Canadians. When those vaccines are approved, we will then see additional vaccines come into Canada, and that set of numbers that I gave you, 6 million Q1, 23 million Q2, 84 million cumulative in Q3, that will all move up once additional vaccines are approved, and we will see those timelines hopefully accelerating. In closing, I want to say that next quarter is going to be what we call the big lift. And that's only counting 2 suppliers. We are going to need to depend on each other and work together for the deployment and smooth rollout, which is in provincial and territorial jurisdiction, largely speaking. And so we will bring the vaccines to Canada, and the provinces and territories are going to be responsible for rolling that out. Having said that, we have been purchasing supplies right across the board. Those low dead volume syringes that Japan could not secure, and that they had to ultimately dump Pfizer vaccines because they didn't have the syringes in place. We have secured 72.45 million of those vaccines, and 2 million of them are in the country and being given to provinces and territories for the most efficient and expeditious extraction of the Pfizer vaccine from the 6-dose vials. I want to just say that the 3 mountains are clearly there in front of us. We have climbed the first 2, and we are still climbing the 3rd mountain. We secured the APAs, but the second set of this climb, the deployment of vaccines across this country, is still taking shape. And I look forward to taking your questions and to working with you all as we move into the next phases of this very steep climb. Thank you so much.
Madam Minister, thank you so much for your remarks. Very informative, and we're seeing already on Slido, our app, that viewers are sending questions at this point. But I'd like to start off with a couple of questions myself. I've seen firsthand you working tirelessly since the start of the pandemic to secure medical supplies and equipment that Canada's needed. You alluded to that in your remarks a little bit earlier. Now, as a result of your efforts, we were one of the very first countries in the world to approve the vaccine and to get supplies. But since then, I was checking yesterday, we've fallen to about 42nd place internationally in terms of the percentage of our citizens who've actually been vaccinated. And many of these other countries that are ahead of us don't produce the vaccines themselves. They have to procure them from abroad. What happened?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. And I actually would like to just put the data that you utilized in your question into context. If you choose to look at the EU as EU countries as one block, we are actually around 11th. If you look at some of the countries that are on that list as well, they have much smaller populations than Canada and much lower and smaller geographical spread. But having said that, it's a legitimate question which I want to address. The important point to remember is that we began vaccinations earlier than we contemplated. And we were able to depend on this rolling review process that Health Canada kind of utilized with other regulators around the world. And as a result, Health Canada approved much earlier than anyone thought it would. We immediately, in the fall, when the results from Pfizer and Moderna came out, kicked it into high gear and negotiated accelerated delivery schedules for that vaccine. So we were one of the first countries in the world to begin vaccinations, one of the first countries in the world to have vaccines occurring right across this country. By the same token, we were hit with the production schedule that Pfizer introduced in mid-January. They told us it was going to be short-term. It was short-term in nature. And I think what you are going to see is the story on vaccinations is still being written. Canada is going to see a very, very steep incline in the next weeks and months ahead. And as a result, I encourage us all to focus on that part of the process. that I know, and I'm telling you, that the steep ramp up of vaccine is going to occur in the next weeks and months, and that is what we need to be focusing on. And I think what we're going to see is we will be moving quite fast. And those stats that you presented, Perrin, are going to change. We are ahead of Australia. We are ahead of France. We are on par with Germany. All of those jurisdictions are our economic peers, and we will continue to work hard as we do as Canadians. We remain on track to receive 1.3 million doses of Moderna next month alone. We remain on track to have the 4 million doses of Pfizer in total coming in. So we're 6 million at Q1. And as I said, 29 million doses in Q2. That is intense, that is heavy, that is steep, and we got to work together to make sure that those vaccines are deployed as effectively and efficiently as possible. That's going to mean coordinating with the provinces and territories, the premiers in particular, as well as the various sites that they are allocating for vaccine deployment. And we will be there as a federal government with all of those supplies. We've provided 440 fridges. Dry ice, we have an on drawdown contract, end-to-end logistics system in FedEx and Innomar, syringes, alcohol swabs, gauze, sharps containers, you name it, we have purchased it in terms of what vaccine supplies are needed. And that is a part of the story that needs to be mentioned also in terms of the supports that we are providing from a procurement perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I would add that as the supplies are procured, the private sector has a key role to play here as well as partners in terms of the rollout. And that offers there to governments at levels that to the extent the private sector can help, we are there. We're anxious to do it. We want to be part of the solution. Turning to the role of the private sector, you've mentioned in interviews that you asked each of the companies with which we've got contracts about the possibility of producing in Canada, but none of them took up the offer. Did they give a reason for not producing here?
Well, thank you. I want to make sure that we understand that it wasn't just to, would you be interested in producing here? And they said no. And that's a way it appears in the press as it is, very short conversation. Not at all. On the contrary, we were heavily engaged with ISED, the ministry responsible for domestic production, and PSPC and each vaccine supplier to discuss the domestic capacity for production. And what the suppliers told us was that the scale of Canada's existing biomanufacturing assets would make it hard to establish production capacity by early 2021. So it was about the timeline, the most expeditious route to ensuring that we saw vaccines in this country that drove our APAs and our negotiations. At the same time as entering into these 7 APAs, we said, well, in the short term, it may not be possible to have a vaccine manufacturer in Canada, but we will continue to work with Canadian manufacturers. So we entered into contracts with the National Research Council, $126 million, Vito Intervac, $35 million, Medicago, a vaccine supplier, $173 million, Providence, $5 million, Precision Nanosystems, $25 million, and then the Novavax memorandum of understanding a couple of weeks ago as well. So there are really 2 tracks here, Perrin. The first is the APA route, which is PSBC and falls under my ministry. And the second is domestic manufacturing and production of vaccines, which falls under the ministry of ISED. And we are pursuing both of those tracks. The Prime Minister and Minister LeBlanc, Minister Champagne are going to be discussing with the premiers and their counterparts as to how we can cooperate as a country to ensure greater domestic manufacturing of vaccines, building on the foundation that I said set in place over the course of the past year. 2 tracks. That's what we got to remember.
Thank you. I want to I'll come back to this in a second, but I see that someone has submitted a question on Slido with regard to what you were saying. They were asking, is the government looking at working with possible domestic vaccine producers like Providence Therapeutics to accelerate vaccinations and ensure access? I'm assuming the answer to that is in the short term, we can't ramp up production to meet the immediate needs between now and September. But over the longer term, and particularly if this is a recurring disease where people will need annual booster shots, will we be building that domestic vaccine capacity?
Most definitely, most definitely. So as I said, we did that with PPE. We were able to do that in fairly short order because of the capacity that existed in the Canadian economy. Stanfield's in Nova Scotia, Lumen Ultra in New Brunswick, Fluid Energy in Alberta, Bauer in Quebec. These are all companies that stepped up to transition their supply chains to the production of PPE. And therefore, the timeline for Canadian domestic ramp up was shorter than what we're seeing in the vaccine context. But by all means, we are working with Canadian business to make sure that we have domestic production of vaccines. We have a company in Burnaby, British Columbia called VanRx that produces fill and finish machines. The Canadian government has purchased some of those machines as well. So we do have domestic capacity here, and we are going to be working on a continual basis with Canadian business to make sure that we have domestic manufacturing of vaccines here. And I just want to touch on a point, Perrin, that was in the news this week. Premier Pallister had mentioned that he was, and the government of Manitoba was blocked from making vaccine procurement agreements with the leading vaccine manufacturers. That is not the case at all. Indeed, we have heard from vaccine manufacturers themselves. AstraZeneca, for example, put out a statement that said that was not the case. We did not do that on N95s. We did not do that on rapid tests. And there is no part of our contractual negotiations that contain a limitation on what suppliers are allowed to do with other clients. The contracts for vaccines are for the purchase of vaccine doses by Canada for Canadians, provided to Canadians by the federal government, but nothing in our agreements limits what provincial or territorial governments can do from a procurement perspective.
Could I just follow up on that? At the risk of drawing you into the perennial Canadian quagmire of the Constitution, throughout the management of the pandemic, we've had the issue where the federal government has clear responsibility in terms of procuring supplies, providing a wide range of leadership. You've written checks and covered much of the financial burden of assisting people during this, yet the delivery of services is provincial. And what business has seen has been a bit of a crazy quilt across the country of conflicting and inconsistent regulations. From your perspective as a federal minister, have you felt that the division of responsibilities within Canada has frustrated the ability to provide as effective a response as Canadians deserved?
Well, thanks for the question. And it does take me back to my constitutional law days, Perrin, and the division of powers between provinces and territories in our Constitution on the one hand. But on the other hand, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're going to do whatever we can to support the provinces and territories in their efforts to deploy and administer healthcare within those provinces, to assist businesses, to assist Canadians, to assist students, to assist those persons with disabilities, to assist businesses with the wage subsidy, for example. Those are all efforts that as a federal government, we want to work with the provinces on. We want to make sure that we are collaborating to the best of our abilities. And that's why you saw the $19 billion Safe Restart Agreement. That's why you saw the back to school agreement with the provinces. That's why you see us making sure that we get those low dose syringes out to the provinces as soon as possible, because we need to work together to get through this pandemic.
An example of the issue is obviously rapid testing. You mentioned it in your remarks a little bit earlier. You have procured millions of rapid testing kits. They're sitting in warehouses across the country, and the distribution rate by provinces is still exceptionally low. They serve no purpose in warehouses. What can you do to ensure that they get out? In some cases, provinces have no interest in terms of seeing those distributed. And is the private sector, in an instance where a provincial government is unable or unwilling to distribute the kits, is the private sector able to apply to you directly for them?
That's a wonderful question. From a procurement perspective, my goal is to make sure we have the supplies in the country. So when the Public Health Agency of Canada tells us that we need N95 masks, we went out and procured over 100 million N95s, and they're in large part, they're in this country. We went out and made sure we have domestic production of N95s, and Medicom in Quebec has produced 6 million N95s. So when the Public Health Agency of Canada said, we need more rapid tests, I, as procurement minister, said, that's our green light procurement team. And we procured over 40 million rapid tests, 19 or 20 million of which have been already deployed to the provinces. So to your question about utilization of rapid tests, we need to utilize the supplies that have been purchased. There's no doubt. And the public health experts continually tell us that testing and contact tracing is a public health measure that can assist with the reopening of businesses, with the use of airlines and the ability to function as a society. That's why we provided over $4 million for contact tracing and testing to the provinces in the Safe Restart Agreement. I think that we can all look to places where testing can be more utilized. Schools come to mind in my estimation. Universities, so university students can get back to their regular lives. We depend on those students to be our future in the workforce, and we need to continue to support them. By the same token, I'll tell you what we did with PPE. We procured PPE as required and requested by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Then we established what was called the Essential Services Contingency Reserve, which is a reserve of additional PPE that organizations can apply to at cost, receive PPE. So your question makes me think that if those rapid tests are more voluminous in number that are being used, perhaps the federal government should also establish a contingency reserve of testing, and that is something that I will look into. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that'd be very welcomed by the private sector. There are many businesses that are looking to roll out rapid testing. We believe it's critical for the reopening of the economy. If we're dependent on provincial governments that maybe recalcitrant to actually roll out these kits, we need access to them. And one of the questions that's come in on Slido as well is people are asking, is the federal government prepared to do procurement to make it available, not just on rapid tests, but in other areas of supplies that business is going to need?
Well, that is a conversation that we are actively having right now. I fully 100% agree with you, the importance of building up supplies of testing and tracing materials. That is why we entered into the contracts that we did for testing materials for 40 million rapid tests. But that's in addition to the standardized testing materials, which we also procured, which was very difficult to do. And we now have domestic production of the testing materials at Lumen Ultra in New Brunswick. All that to say that we as a federal government want to support business. We believe in the necessity to support businesses as the backbone of the Canadian economy. And as a result, we will do what we need to in order to ensure that businesses remain stable and can indeed assist with the opening up of the economy in the second quarter and the third quarter of this year. It is crucial to Canadians at large and the Canadian economy that Canadian businesses are supported. You'll have to remember two things, Perrin. I was a professor of corporate law and securities law. I fully understand the importance of business and the ability to reopen safely and effectively in order for our economy as a whole to function. Secondly, I'm a member of parliament from Oakville, and I see firsthand the needs of businesses right across this town to function, not just because they're businesses per se, but underneath every business is a family. And that family needs to function as individuals to support themselves. And those two things motivate me every day. We need to support business. I am here for you as a procurement minister to ensure we have the supplies in this country to do so. And I will work with my cabinet colleagues, Minister Ng on small businesses, for example, Minister Freeland, our Minister of Finance, to make sure that we have a coordinated effort to support businesses. So let's continue this conversation in terms of rapid tests, in terms of vaccines, in terms of PPE, to make sure we are there for you.
Great, thank you. Minister, we were scheduled to wrap up at about now, but we started a little bit late, and I'm wondering whether I can exercise President's prerogative and ask for another 5 minutes of your time to cover a couple of other questions just before we wrap up.
Definitely.
The first deals with, great, and thank you, and we greatly appreciate your candor in this discussion. The first question deals with lessons learned. Over the last year, we've seen the cost of having to rely on other countries in times of crisis. An example of that was Donald Trump blocking the exports of N95 masks and the musing by the EU about restricting exports of vaccines. As we look at the lessons that we've learned, is one of them that it is simply too risky to allow ourselves to become dependent on other countries, including our friends, and that in a number of areas, we need, as a matter of national security, to maintain a domestic capacity in good times and bad to protect Canadians.
So lots in that question. Let me first address N95s and the United States, and then I'll move on to domestic production. The first part of the question relating to those N95s really was one of the let's just highlights or lowlights of the pandemic in terms of we needed product, and that product was in the United States. 3M, known as the gold standard of N95 masks, and we were in a situation where we were worried about whether we would have those, at the time, about 500,000 masks coming across the border. I immediately got on the phone with Penny Wise, the president of 3M Canada, and said, Penny, we need those masks and they need to cross the border. I called the ambassador and said, Ambassador Hillman, we need those masks. What are we going to do to get them across the border? We were negotiating so that's the company level, the diplomatic level, and then right across government to ensure we could get those masks into the country. And Perrin, they did cross the border. But what they crossed the border, and I'll tell you, part of my life is texting people to find out, are the masks across the border, are the vaccines across the border, etc. So that was the telltale sign that we could not depend on foreign imports of goods for the health and safety of Canadians. So Nav Bains, who was the Minister of ISED at the time, worked extremely hard with across government and with businesses across the country to build up domestic capacity of PPE. And it's the same thing that Minister Champagne is doing at ISED in terms of building up domestic manufacturing capacity of vaccines. I'm on the procurement side, which is, as you may know, a department and a ministry, and even as minister, an area where my motto is, we need product now. How are we going to get product now? And so that's why we entered into those 7 APAs, and we did so on a very expedited basis. That's why we've accelerated the delivery of doses from Pfizer from Q3 to Q2. So my goal in talking to Pfizer isn't simply to say, let me know when the doses are coming. It is to say, thank you for sending us doses, but we need more doses and we need them earlier. And so you can see how the domestic production question that you asked really bleeds over into the negotiations that we're having right now, both in ISED in terms of domestic production, but also in terms of the current suppliers. My sole goal is to get vaccines into this country as early as possible. And we will not stop. I will not stop until that goal is accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question. We have hundreds of business people online watching us now. What is it that business can do to assist here? It needs to be a Team Canada approach. We've got 2 options that business has. One is to sit on the sidelines and complain about what governments are doing. The other is to roll up our sleeves and be part of the solution. What can we do to help?
I appreciate that so much. I appreciate the way in which you reached out to me at the beginning of the pandemic. I appreciate your role on the Supply Council, and I appreciate the constructive role that business wants to play in this pandemic. Believe me, I am well aware of the numerous criticisms that government faces. I will say that your formation of the council, your inviting me here today, your communication about your willingness to help will be something that we will take you up on. We need to work with business. We need to engage with this council and find out what it is that you think would be effective in terms of supports, economic or otherwise, to the business community going forward. We need to hear from you in terms of the way in which you see the deployment occurring. Of course, it's not a federal decision-making process in terms of the way in which those vaccines are at the very end of the line going to be getting into people's arms. But we need to work with you to hear your views and act on them. And I'll take the rapid test point back. That's a very important point that I can consider as a procurement minister. And I look forward to speaking with your council, and invite me to come and talk to you so we can hear directly from the council in terms of what they're suggesting needs to happen. And I think if I could be so bold to offer a suggestion prior to that meeting, it would be useful if you split your suggestions into timeframes. This is what we see needs to be done in the next 4 to 6 weeks. This is what we see in the next 2 to 4 months, and so on, so that we can make sure to act on the items that need to be acted on as soon as possible. You can rest assured that I'm going to continue to procure rapid tests, PPE, and vaccines for Canadians. But I can also build on that procurement, work with my colleagues across the ministerial table and our Prime Minister to ensure that businesses and therefore Canadians are supported right across the board.
Minister, thank you very much for that. When I introduced you a little bit earlier, I referred to you as being smart, thoughtful, caring, and very hardworking. And you've demonstrated that fully in this conversation. We thank you for being with us today, and we thank you for your work on behalf of Canadians.
Karen, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I will say that I have found conversations like this to be so important in the policymaking process. You and your members are the lifeblood of Canadian business and the Canadian economy. And without a strong economy, we will not be able to come out of this pandemic in the way that we need to. So I look forward to having additional conversations. Invite me back so we can do a second take on how the steep incline of vaccine deployment occurred and what more needs to be done. Thank you so much.
Will do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.